Fusion Time, and this is my podcast where I deep dive into matters surrounding HR tech and the future of work. I was a former HR serial entrepreneur and write extensively about the future of work on my blog. You may know me better through the Singapore HR Tech Market Map that I created in 2017. In this podcast, I speak with the people who are enabling the future of work. From mindfulness coach to employee engagement platform, they are all helping companies to better navigate rising work and business demands. I'm hoping that sharing in this podcast will help you better prepare yourself and your business for what the future of work may bring. Hi Sonali, thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Hi, Adrian. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin by helping the audience to understand more about your background and the chain of events that led you to where you are today as the VP in Product and People Science at Engage Rocket.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking, and I'm happy to share. Um, it's a long and winding road that actually brings me here. I haven't had quite a linear path in my career. I actually stumbled onto people analytics about 4 years ago, actually. Prior to that, throughout my career, I've really been a management consultant. Started my career with McKinsey and Company, and then with Deloitte Consulting in the US, where I was primarily working in healthcare, finance, and supply chain optimization studies. And after that, I decided to start my own consulting firm in India. And there were quite a few organizations that needed consulting in their HR function, that needed specifically analytics consulting in their HR function. I ran my consulting firm for a while and a few years, and I realized this was actually we were onto something. There was something big happening in the space of HR. This whole digitization happening in the space of HR that needed some attention. And so I upskilled, did a few courses, got my master's in data science. And ran the firm for a few years before Uber hired me as the head of people analytics in APAC. And that's truly when the formalization of my exposure to HR analytics took place. And I just realized this was a field that was so close to my heart. It sat right at the intersection of human psychology, human behavior, behavioral economics, technology, because that's the only way you can truly scale, as well as math and analytics. And it was just the perfect way to combine my love for people and my love for data. So I haven't looked back, committed myself to this function, and recently, 6 months ago, joined Engage Rocket in APAC, leading their product and people science function. So still on course and still very close to the career that I hope to stay committed to for as long as I can.
And with all this past 6 years of experience in analytics, what are some of the key findings that you have been observing across the different HR departments you've spoken with, and what are some of the key surprises?
No, that's a great question. So one of the things that I realized was I'll talk about my all of my observations in the pre-COVID and the post-COVID. I feel like it's a completely different space. So of course, in the last 6 years of me working with HR functions, I realized just how much of a gap there was between HR, the way they work, and the business. And this is in everything, right? This was in the way that numbers were reported, the way quarterly meetings were held, the way that there was a sense of accountability, how we knew business was on track versus how we could tell HR was on track. There was just a huge divide, and it was almost painful watching HR and business in the same room together because they just weren't speaking the same language. And having been exposed to that early on, and especially working with the companies that kind of adopted analytics in a more data-driven approach, I realized just how much analytics can bridge HR and business and really get them to start speaking the same language, get excited about the same metrics, get excited about the same goal. So that's been super fun and exciting for me to watch and just have these two functions come together. Now, post-COVID, more than ever, HR and business are looking in the same direction. I think everyone understands that productivity, well-being, engagement, they all drive innovation. They all drive business outcomes. So finally, I feel like these two critical functions have come together. And I think a huge part of that is owed to just the ability for analytics to get them to start seeing the same things in the same way.
Interesting for you to mention where HR as well as business can be, it's quite painful to see them in the same room because they're not speaking the same language, and often
Mhm.
seeing that in many instances, even until today. And
Mhm.
specific to what I mentioned earlier on analytics, something else that I'm picking up from a lot of HR people, at least the one that I had a chance to speak with, they are still quite 50-50 or sitting on the fence about analytics. I think most of them know that it is important, but for those that actually try to put a step in, they will often come back with a form of resistance or some form of resistance, like not enough data or the data isn't clean. But if you look at other departments, you don't see the finance department telling you we don't have enough numbers. You don't see the
Mhm.
salespeople telling you we don't have enough sales figures, we can't make a decision. Why is that the case in HR department? Or is it just me seeing this kind of things happening?
No, that's an astute observation. It does happen. Of course, HR and business, their partnership is its own sort of subject, and did touch upon that. But just individually looking at the HR function and their ability to adopt technology, I think that has been a little bit of a bone of contention. And it was, and in maybe some cases still is, the reason for the divide between HR and business, and the approach to solving people slash business problems. And I think it owes its reasoning to three things. First, let me start with the mindset, right? And the mindset is really a product of the skills, the people, the culture within a function. Now, the mindset of HR has not been a product mindset or technology mindset, a data driven mindset. For the longest time, it has been one of empathy, of one of individualization, of personalization, of listening, which for a long time was considered at odds with technology and having cookie cutter responses or scaling policies and processes. So I think HR resists analytics because some people actually believe it runs counter to empathic listening. The second challenge, I think, is capability. I mean, being totally honest, there are far fewer data savvy professionals and data literate members of the HR community as compared to other functions, or at least have been in the recent past, just because that skill is not hired for and even less trained for. HR professionals aren't exposed to technical training and digital exposure as compared to their, say, counterparts in sales or IT or operations. And the third reason I would say is vendor maturity, right? I think HR tech is also maturing and it's currently less intuitive and easy to use, I would think, than some other tech solutions for mature functions. For all of these three reasons, I think there's just been a divide in the recent past, but I can say with certainty that is changing. In terms of all three, the mindset and the capability, as well as the technology solutions now, I think they're all gearing towards the inevitable future of digitization and analytics.
And for companies that would be keen to really consider taking the first baby steps into
Mhm.
this aspect, and for them, they may not know exactly how to begin with, what to look into. What are some of the starter advice you would want to give to them?
Thanks for asking that question. So, I would actually relate it back to the three things that I talked about that are challenges, which is mindset, capability, and maturity. For capability, I would say the number one is really to both recruit for as well as train for data literacy. I do think HR functions need to commit themselves to a certain minimum, competency level in data analytics, as well as a product mindset and technology mindset, just so to be able to equip them to be able to solve the company and the business problems in the way that eventually we will need to, especially now in the digital era brought about by COVID. So the first is just recruit for and train for data literacy. The second would be processes, right? So mindsets can be changed with processes and rituals that are very deliberate and conscious. So if there is and this is where I think leadership comes in, right? If the CHRO makes a decision to change and commit to a mindset shift within the HR function, then then this function will be unstoppable. But what that means is that from the top, I think there is a requirement to commit to looking at HR metrics, to ask people to share insights supported by data whenever there is a presentation, to actually include within the competency framework exposure and competency in analytics. So those are the processes and the policy changes that will need to be brought about from the top. And the third would be vendor maturity. Now, here, I would say there are quite a few HR tech vendors that are making that leap towards making technology more intuitive. But what a function can do is actually invest in good HR tech solutions that align with where they are on the curve, on the maturity curve. And once a vendor understands the context of your organization, I think, and once there is a match, we're likely to see adoption take off. So, yeah, those would be my three recommendations.
In Singapore context, many businesses are actually pretty small. Then, at least the last I read, 99% of the companies here are defined as SME. Now,
Mhm.
to what you mentioned earlier on about analytics, it of course occurred to me that something like this will only be useful when there's a lot of big data, which of course come from a larger headcount. Within Singapore context, or at least looking at the landscape we're in right now, is there a magic figure where analytics should kick in?
I have two answers to that usually, and I can't decide which one I feel more committed to. So I know there is value in having an analytics mindset and a technology driven mindset. I've seen organizations as small as 50 also adopt it, right? It just brings about fairness and belongingness, and you can tie the work that you're doing at two business outcomes. So I would say you're never too small to adopt the analytics mindset, just because I know the correlations between employee and people outcomes to customer outcomes and business outcomes. Having a pulse of your workforce is the shortest way to improve customer loyalty and really to keep a tab on those business outcomes. So I would say an organization can never be too small to embark on that journey. But when it comes to having a dedicated people analytics sort of function or resource, I do think the number around 200 to 300 is really when one needs to start thinking about having a dedicated function. Before that, I think this can be outsourced, trained. There are various ways to solve for the data literacy gap through outsourcing, but I think an in house function is probably most relevant at about the 200 to 300 mark of employees.
And of course, analytics in analytics case is really about trying to manage your resources, which is your people, much better to optimize them for better outputs or even better productivity. With that note, do you have any stories or any case studies that you can share with us about how a company may have done certain decision making without the benefit of analytics and how they managed to do it better when analytics were put in place?
Absolutely. There is actually quite a few stories because I was consulting organizations for the longest time and in people analytics. And it was always, there's two stories that come to mind. One is pre COVID and the other is post COVID. Pre COVID, one of the clients that I was working with, they were very proud of their culture. This was a very large media house in the APAC region with publications in various types of media. And they were very proud of their culture, and I remember meeting the CEO and who just wanted an annual engagement report for the shareholders, and he just assumed that it's going to be great and there's really nothing for them to learn just because they had done a previous survey, a very generic survey of their employees in the recent past, and they hadn't learned much, and the results were as expected.
So the leader just wanted a paper exercise.
Exactly. And that's when I came in and we ran this study, but of course this time we were a lot more detailed, right? Where there were a lot more employee attributes we pulled in. We went granular down to every function. We and then when the report came out, we looked at it through various results, and we looked for correlations, and we looked for those real insights that a cursory sort of descriptive report doesn't really give you. Um, and the organization learned some startling things about the state of diversity and inclusion in their organization. They learned that the attrition amongst women was incredibly high, almost three times. They had attributed it to external factors, but then when this report came out, they realized it was actually internal, it was all cultural. We did some open ended sort of text analysis with using topic modeling, and just the themes that were coming out spoke of discrimination and feeling like there's a meeting culture, needing to work overtime, lack of work life flexibility, having an input driven, activity driven culture, not outcome driven. All of these things, right? That absolutely there was no way to get access to these rich insights through, let's say, just a simple 5 question survey with a score. You need to get to the truth. You often need to look 3 levels deeper. And I think for this organization, this really helped open their eyes, and they called for a department led meeting, then created some policy level changes that just wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't chosen to look deeper. So I actually commend the leader for being willing and open, even if he was surprised by the results, and actually committing to a way forward.
That's a lot of things that you picked up for a leader who thought that everything is nice and dandy.
Yes.
And how are they doing right now? Are they still implementing, or do you have any idea if they're still on very much on track based on what you have
Yes.
shared with them?
Yeah, they had a 1 year plan, a program, which I think they increased to then 3 years. And they have been able to improve their representation. They've been able to improve their belongingness. And they're actually making the best part is to me that the process became integrated within their business. So they actually started having department level goals, evaluating department heads and managers on engagement, on employee sentiment, and the sense of belongingness and fairness within their teams. And so not just looking at as one number to report to shareholders, but really making it, integrating it within the fabric of the organization, making it part of every operating meeting. So they've been able to make strides. Their attrition has reduced. It's a long-term project, and anyone who thinks they can turn around culture in 3 months is really kidding themselves. But it's been really heartening for me to see the improvement.
I think it's really giving kudos to the CEO as well, because if he or she has been a bit more insistent that everything is fine, just on paper, I don't need the granular
Yes.
details, we
Right.
wouldn't be able to share this story today. And that's definitely something that I'm still seeing quite a lot in many different senior management, especially in some of the groups that I'm part of, where many senior HR leaders are still trying to grapple with the situation where senior leaders insist on people coming back to office despite what the government says, or measuring them based on inputs instead of outputs despite what is going on out there. What are the things that management are actually doing wrong right now, and what should they do instead? These are questions which I think I am seeing quite a fair bit of it. Are there any analytics or any data that shows you, for example, things like trusting your employees is really the key to productivity, not measuring them on outputs, measuring the time that they clock in? I even heard stories of companies that insist on their people being on a Zoom call from 9 to 6. Their excuse is, oh, this is going to drive connectedness, but in a way, it's really just to monitor and make sure that they're in front of a computer. Do you have any opinions or any things you'd like to share with managers out there who are still living in the Stone Age?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the topics that I am doing considerable research in is in performance management, right? And how management views performance, and typically performance management practices, which actually very tightly linked to how we think of accountability, how managers and leaders think of implementing accountability within their teams. And this is one of those systems that has been broken for a very long time. No one has a better solution, and we're all just trudging along, accepting that the way that we currently hold others accountable, the way that we measure performance is in fact valid, when it's it's easy. It's the easy way out. It is not more effective. It just happens to be an easier process to implement. And there are so many things. COVID-19, as you rightly said, has just brought this to light, that there are so many things that are wrong with this process and that can be improved. I'm just going to share some statistics here, because this is all top of mind. And since I've been doing some research, there's many research papers written on this subject. And all of them consistently point towards certain figures which are frankly appalling. For example, 91% of employees say that effectively holding others accountable is one of their company's top leadership development needs. Um, Within many organizations that I've worked, high performers consistently felt that their performance was not valued, while low performers felt that the organization did not do a good job of managing performance, or stepping in and helping with growth and development. Everyone seems to be unhappy. And to me, I think what we're doing wrong is we have a culture of evaluation, of measurement, of like you said, evaluating by input. And in COVID 19, that's just not working anymore. Just because everyone's contexts are so different, everyone's input is so different, it's not a cookie cutter schedule 9 to 5 anymore. And so, really, the only option is to measure people by their outcome, and what they produce, and what is the value that they add to the organization. And the problem is that culture, while company CEOs are good with that, and they want to promote that, managers and leaders aren't really trained in that, and that way of thinking. So This is absolutely, I would say, one of the biggest priorities in an organization that HR and managers and leaders should commit themselves to, which is capability building in the space of performance management, coaching, creating and nurturing their employees, building psychological safety, and building an environment of trust, all of which will allow people to bring out their best, right? And I would just end with this, which is the role of managers and leaders should be to bring out the best within their teams and creating the conditions that are required to do so, versus sitting back and evaluating the output or the input. I would say it really is about helping them and do their best. So that's going to need, again, a huge mindset shift. But I do think HR is up for the challenge.
It sounds a lot like parenting.
Actually, that's not a bad analogy. I've heard that quite often. I think a manager does need to be a good parent at times. Yeah.
And speaking of parenting, we are, of course, in a current era where there are so many different demographics within the same organizations, from boomers to Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. Personally, going back to the parenting analogy, I just have a kid who is, I think, is in his adolescence because he started to be more on his own, shut the door. And I think, if I don't remember wrongly, Barack Obama once said when a kid turned 13, they will go to their room, shut the door, and they'll come out of the room when they turn 21. I think that's something that a lot of parents would probably concur. But back to how this group of different demographics are actually within the office environment. Is this something that HR or people managers or senior managers would have to take into consideration? Are they different? Are they responding to different needs, different engagement, different management style? Because when I look at a lot of management training, honestly, catering to the different requirements or the different needs, if there is any, from this diverse group of people doesn't really pop up very often. I do understand though that you did some work on this in Uber. Could you share with us some of your lessons, some of the things you picked up, and what can we learn from all that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking, Adrian. That's an important point, and we don't talk about it enough. Agreed. The generational diversity, so to speak, within an organization. It's just not addressed. We like to think of our employee workforce as homogenous when they're not. They are diverse, and this is just one of the ways in which there is diversity in the team. In answering that question, I actually just want to touch upon diversity a little bit, and then I'll jump a little bit deeper into generational diversity. I think diversity is misunderstood as being just about gender. Most organizations believe that increasing the representation of, let's say, women, being a little controversial here, but just increasing, let's say, the representation of women in the organization is hitting a diversity goal. And diversity is really not about that. It's about all of the employee attributes, the entire demographic mix, anything that makes us different. And I think gender is just one of the ways that is understood to bring about a difference. The reason why people have a narrow view of diversity is because they don't know there are other attributes that also lead to differences in the way you experience your workforce. And to me, this is really a problem of knowledge and awareness, right? Most organizations aren't aware that Gen X, Gen B, Gen Z, and boomers are actually very different in the way that they interact with the organization, and their needs are very different. So to me, I was actually, yes, first exposed to this within Uber, which has a very young workforce. The average age is low. And to me, it's really not about within Uber what we saw, but what we realized was that organizations and sub-organizations or functions within the organization just interacted very differently. Their needs were very different. And when we, of course, analytically speaking, when we threw age into the mix, we realized that mathematically we could see those results playing out. We could clearly see the role that age plays in the way the employees produce work, in the way the employees express their needs. Now, this is a little tricky because while, of course, we touched the surface where I was introduced to the concept, I knew enough looking at the data to know that there's something going on with age that definitely has a significant impact on our people outcomes and the way our employees experience the workforce, the sort of the work, the experience, their environment. But age is very controversial. Many countries have legal constraints in how you're allowed to use age data. And so it wasn't something that I could go to the bottom of as much as I needed to. Especially countries like the US have many laws against ageism, and even being able to analyze that, there's limited opportunity for that. But it's actually something that while it was seeded for me in my previous organization, I've been able to really further and take a deep dive into when in my work at Engage Rocket. So very recently, we found that there was a significant difference in millennials versus boomers in four main areas: their adaptability to remote work, feelings of burnout, and resilience in the organization. And just going to give you an example, right? Millennials are far more likely to be burnt out than boomers. Millennials have far less faith in that their organization is going to survive this pandemic or in the future of their organization compared to boomers. Now, this might seem as if it's just employee sentiment playing out, right? But this theme consistently runs across all employee experience drivers. We found significant differences in the way that millennials and boomers experience the workforce. And one of the recommendations that I made in the previous report that we recently published was that HR functions absolutely need to have different approaches to millennials, to different age groups. I'm just calling out millennials and boomers because the differences were most prominent. But really, and there's three areas that the differences play out most, right? One is communication. Millennials have a very different need for communication than boomers. Organizations need to be able to communicate more frequently, more clearly, with greater reassurance about the future of work if they want to communicate to millennials. Second was in the adaptation to digital, the new digital world. Millennials have much more of an exposure, willingness, ability to tap onto digital skills. They also have a greater need to invest in their own digital skills and an interest in digitization. So organizations would need to be able to respond to that and be able to provide, let's say, the younger generation with the tools that they need to do their work, or they feel that they need to do their work. Personalization is really inevitable, right? We see it in the customer experiences, but even in employee experiences, organizations need to find a way to be able to personalize their response and their policies to organizations based on the generations that they're working with and based on the generational mix that every company has. And we'll see a far greater boost to productivity, to engagement, and to innovation when we are able to personalize these experiences, which obviously can't be done without data and technology. So it's really making a case for this investment we're talking about. To answer your question on the differences and the differences in employee sentiment across different age groups, I just wanted to call out one data point that I uncovered when we at Engage Rocket did a study on the state of employee experience in Singapore. And we analyzed about 80 plus companies. So I know that this statistic is completely reliable and significant. We actually found that employees in the age group of 20 to 29 report being burnt out. So 20% of them just say that we're absolutely unable to avoid burnout, while when we looked at the above 60 age, only 5% of them felt that they couldn't manage and couldn't avoid burnout. Now, that's almost a 4x difference. And this was just one of the examples. We consistently saw this in almost all critical, significant drivers of employee experience, resilience being another one. So there is a huge and a stated and an established difference in sentiment across these two age groups. And I just wanted to call out that this difference exists. And so all that needs to be done is for HR functions to acknowledge it and start to create policies that are customized to these age groups.
I think that's really well said. The personalization part is just like how many companies would do marketing. Hotel, for example, to cater to the older audience, the boomers, maybe you want to market more about the exclusive spa that is on the top floor that you could just take one lift and gain access to. Whereas for the younger generation, the millennials, you may want to market about the night markets, which is just around the corner. So it's the same thing, but you're just marketing it very differently because the needs, the requirements, the wants of all these different groups would be very different. And I guess that's something that data could definitely tell us about. And we also talk about this diversity aspect here. I wrote an article on diversity, equality, inclusion recently, and I have to market like crazy because there's just so little people picking that up. You mentioned, of course, the need for diversity and all that kind of stuff. Why, in your opinion, do you think Asia companies or maybe Singapore companies, the ones that I'm more familiar with, are quite reluctant and to really move into this space? Why do you think that's the case, and what are they missing out on?
Absolutely. That's a good call out, and it's an astute observation. I agree. I've had the same experience. Just to give you an example, I was reading a report where about what are the top two people outcomes that CHROs in the West, specifically in the US, are most concerned about, and diversity and inclusion was one of them. The other being attrition, and these were the top two. But we're not seeing the same sort of prioritization of D&I in APAC. And for me, I think, Adrian, like I mentioned, the first is just a lack of understanding of what is diversity. And the second is the lack of understanding of what to do about it. Right. So the first is, like I said, diversity is misunderstood as being having a narrow definition of, let's say, about gender representation. To me, which is, it's really just a sliver of what diversity and inclusion is about. So that's one, right? We need to expand knowledge about what is diversity. And the second important related point is when you start to expand the idea of diversity, then you also start to think about inclusion. One of my colleagues, he was the head of diversity and inclusion at Uber in APAC, and he used to say that diversity and inclusion is really about having a small D and a big I. And I loved that. So diversity and inclusion, you should be focusing on the inclusion, which has a far bigger impact towards all your organization's outcomes compared to the D, the small d. So the small d refers to representation, right? Having a healthy mix of people within the organization with representation from different races, different ethnicities, different culture, different ages, different educational qualifications, and different gender, etc. But really, it's to give you an analogy, right? Diversity is about inviting all these different people to a party. But inclusion is if they feel comfortable enough to dance. And that's the part that most organizations are missing, which is it's not about just hitting the target of a certain number for people to have in the organization, which almost feels like a forced, unfair mandate sometimes. But it's really about inclusion, which is building that sense of belonging, building the sense of psychological safety so people feel comfortable speaking up and being themselves and bringing their authentic selves to work. Now, when you focus on the D&I, that's when you start to unlock the benefits of D&I, which is better customer innovation, being able to address the needs of your customers in a more holistic way, being able to be more productive, being able to be, in the long term, just a better organization with better business outcomes and goals and hitting those milestones. But it's a difficult path to get there. First, you need to understand diversity, start to measure elements of diversity, incorporate them as goals within the organization, then think of a way to measure inclusion, which is measured by the sense of belonging. So it's a difficult commitment and a difficult path. And I really think that the issue is about awareness, but also then about capability on addressing D&I within the organization. Once we achieve these two, then I really do think that APAC will benefit immensely from committing to this as an outcome.
And I think these are things that it takes two hands to clap, as much as we would expect HR as well as the people managers to do something about it. I think even as the employees, there are things that you can do about it as well. And I'd like to share a story I've read in a book recently. I can't exactly remember the character, but there was always this group meeting going on, senior management. And the thing is, whenever they take a bio break, the guys will, of course, go to the gents. They will continue the meeting discussion in the toilet. And when they come out from the toilet where they resume the meeting, there's this missing gap of 10 minutes that other people, especially the ladies, would not get. So one of the lady were telling them when it came to another toilet break that if you guys are going to continue the meeting in there, I'm coming in. And that really cracked everyone up, and of course reminded people in a very jovial manner that you have to remember there are people outside of your circle that should also be part of this discussion. And with that, I hope it would really give people some ideas on how to move the needle forward. Sonali, thank you so much for your time today in helping us to better understand about your experience as how analytics could be beneficial for companies out there. For people that's keen to learn more about what you do, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn under Sonali Sharma, and I'm usually responsive. I'd be happy to speak to people that are interested to learn more about HR. It's a passion subject for me, especially when it comes to HR analytics. I'm always looking for people to have these conversations with. Thank you so much, Adrian. I loved being on your show, and it's been such a great conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the podcast. You can refer to the show notes for links to more information about our guests and their businesses. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would be helpful to give a review on iTunes or follow me on Spotify. If you're using Overcast, please hit the star button under the episode. That will help get this episode and podcast out to more people who may find it useful. I'll see you in the next episode of The Adrian Han Show.